I hope you enjoy the talk. As Anna said, oh, sorry, okay. As Anna mentioned, I'm a lecturer in physical geography at Stirling. I joined Stirling about 1.5 years ago, and I'm still relatively new to the MASTS community, and most of you have no idea who I am. So I'm just going to make a quick introduction. As my name and surname suggests, and my accent completely reveals, I'm not really from Scotland. I'm a Portuguese, and I'm from a small coastal town in the north of the country. And I did my training in geography at the University of Coimbra almost 20 years ago, I have to confess. Then I went and did a PhD in marine geosciences at the University of the Algarve, also in Portugal, but in collaboration with the Ulster University in Northern Ireland. Following that, I did a couple of postdocs, still based in the Algarve, but in partnership with UKZN in South Africa and Ulster. And then after that first postdoc, I really moved to South Africa and spent 2 years at UKZN, followed by 1 year at the University of Ulster. Over that period, I looked into mostly in terms of coastal response, mostly to storms in a variety of different environments. And I also worked on nearshore processes and nearshore geophysics for understanding storm impacts further away from the coast and into the sea. After those 2 postdocs, I made a final leap and a shorter leap across the North Channel to Scotland. Here, because I'm a geographer, I always like to have maps. So here you can see the spread of my working locations over the past few years. Okay, it's not working. Okay. So in terms of research, as I kind of briefly mentioned, I'm a coastal geomorphologist, and my focus is on the morphodynamics of coastal systems. And morphodynamics is the interaction between the drivers, the processes, and the responses. And overall, I'm interested in understanding process response relationships in sandy beaches and barriers in areas where waves are the dominant forcing agent. In these environments, most of my work revolves around investigating the impact of storms and how the coast recovers from extreme events. And besides a strong reliance on fieldwork to monitor the evolution of sandy coasts, I also use exploratory modeling to improve the understanding about storm processes as well as coastal response to sea level rise. This work often has a link to supporting coastal protection and management, and I've worked with authorities and companies on some problematic coastal situations. Now, enough about me. I'm assuming most of you will be fairly aware of some of these global threats to beach environments. I'm still gonna kind of make a relatively quick overview of those. So sea level rise is perhaps the first thing that comes to everyone's mind when you think about beaches and threats, and not just sea level rise, but also extreme events. However, currently, most coastlines and beaches are not really being threatened by either of those, but by the aggressive use of the coast. Humans have been using the coast for millennia, but over the past decades, probably the past century, but increasing over the past decades, that use has really been magnified. From the encroaching of buildings and infrastructure into the active coastal zone, to widespread sand deficits because of sand mining or along the rivers and along the coast, because of increased population and coastal development, very often placed in the most dynamic parts of the coastal zone. All of this led to extensive modification of the beach and dune systems, with often the emplacement of coastal protection structures that not only impact their immediate vicinity because they're put in place to protect specific areas, but they also propagate to adjacent coastal areas. So you have areas that are being affected, not because they've been directly interfered, but because effects of coastal modification propagate throughout the coastal area. On a global level, over the past 30 years, coastlines have been eroding in many parts of the world, but in other areas, they've also been accreting. And this is a relatively recent paper by a group of researchers in the Netherlands, mostly in the Netherlands, that looked at satellite data around the globe to identify where we can find most erosion and accretion. And overall, their conclusions show that roughly one quarter of the coast of the world's beaches are being eroded, but also approximately one quarter are accreting. So there's almost a balance, and roughly half of the world's beaches are not changing that much. Of course, this is a relatively coarse view of the state of the beaches, but it does give puts things a little bit into perspective. These are, however, long-term trends that, while they're relevant, they don't tell the entire story, and they mask a lot of variability, particularly variability associated with storm events. Storms are often the main mechanism driving the evolution of sandy coastlines, and often beach dynamics are heavily dependent on storm-induced erosion and post-storm recovery cycles. So storms are also the most relevant coastal hazards, leading to erosion and flooding that endangers the human uses of the coast. So storms overall rank very high in terms of public attention and concern. And when we think about future storms and how coasts will respond to future storms, there's still a lot of uncertainty. Nevertheless, recent work made at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission has highlighted that there's going to be an increase in extreme sea levels reached during storms along most of the world's coastline, and this is expected to increase it will increase up to 2050 and continue to increase until the end of the century. We can see clearly on this diagram that some areas are expected to experience significant increases. Others will see decreases. Others, the uncertainty is too big for the results to be meaningful. But overall, there is a clear tendency for extreme sea levels and extreme sea levels leading to increased coastal flooding hazards, increased coastal erosion as well. So now I'm going to make a small poll that Anna has just shared with you. Here, the idea is to have your views about which types of storms typically reach the Scottish coastline. Just to check your understanding of storms before I move into a slide that explores this topic. Okay, we're having quite a few.
So good answers coming in from people. Just to let everyone know that it is anonymous, so don't worry if you're unsure about selecting what option. Just choose one that you think is right.
Yep.
Couple more seconds for everyone.
Okay, so here's the results. I hope you're seeing that most of you got it perfectly well. It's extratropical depressions and post-tropical storms, and most frequently extratropical depressions are the types of storms that reach the Scottish coastline. There's not really hurricanes or tropical cyclones, but we'll get that in a second. There you go. So I'm just going to briefly mention the two main types of storms that impact coastlines around the globe. We fundamentally have extratropical storms, which are the ones that occur most around the mid to high latitudes. This image shows the track density and kinetic energy of tropical cyclones. It gives us an idea of the main paths and where most extratropical storms reach during the winter, because extratropical cyclones are mostly concentrated during the winter on both hemispheres. And for the careful eye, you'll see that Scotland is very well aligned with the North Atlantic storm track. So it's no surprise that we get struck by countless extratropical cyclones every year. To be honest, throughout the entire, every winter, and also throughout the year. That's what I meant. And now, apart from extratropical cyclones, we also have tropical cyclones, which are the other dominant storm type globally. And we can see that most of these events reach different areas from extratropical cyclones. We can also see that the most intense tropical cyclones tend to occur in the North Pacific, where they are called typhoons. And again, for the most inquisitive eyes, you'd have seen or noticed that some tropical storms seem to reach the British Isles. But the reality is most of them will have transitioned to post-tropical storms. So when they reach the British Isles, they no longer hold tropical characteristics. Okay. So when the storm hits the coast, and now we've seen the very different types of storms, but when the storm hits the coast, we basically have a combination of extreme winds, very large waves. We also have a storm surge, which happens when, due to the combined action of low atmospheric pressure and wind, if that wind is blowing onshore and contributing to the piling of water against the coast. And we shouldn't also forget that these drivers interact with tides. So the tidal stage and the tidal stage and the fact that we can be on either spring or neap tides has an impact on how storms impact the coastline. So all of these are particularly relevant for determining the erosional and flooding potential of a storm. And when we combine the extreme meteorological and oceanographic conditions, we have the drivers of drivers of morphological change on the coast. However, that morphological change is also influenced by the characteristics of the coast. So overall, the response will be proportional to the magnitude of the storm, but dependent on the characteristics of the coast. Okay. So this relationship between the forcing and the response was very elegantly conceptualized by Salinger in 2000 when he proposed the storm impact scale for Barrier Islands. While this is initially developed for Barrier Islands, the reality is that it's been applied for many other different types of coastal settings because it provides a very good framework for improving our understanding of coastal storm impacts, but also for more applied research, such as development of early warning systems for coastal storms. The storm impact scale combines relatively simple indicators of the forcing. For example, here we have the maximum still water level reached by a storm, and also the maximum water level reached by waves during a storm. And it combines with indications, morphological indications of the barrier. In this case, it's represented, in this case, it's represented by a dune or for a, but it can be also the case of a coastal defense structure. And here we would have a different type of barrier, but one that also has morphological characteristics that we can easily define. Once the storm reaches and interacts with the coastline, we have different types of impacts. And Salinger conceptualized that in terms of the impact regimes and distinguished between 4 different impact regimes. On the first impact regime, which is when you have relatively minor storms, when we have relatively minor storms, the waves basically spread throughout the beach. They don't really reach the dunes. So we call this a swash regime because it's just the swash action of the waves that's creating some erosion on the beach. As storms begin to increase in their magnitude, we start to have waves reaching higher on the beach, and they start to impact the dune. In this case, we go into the collision regime, where the dune face starts to be eroded, and you start to see more significant morphological changes. As waves and tides and storm surge start to combine more with more energy, then we start to enter the overwash regime. It's when waves are able to overtop or overwash the barrier. It will be overwash if it's a dune, or overtop if it's a coastal structure. But fundamentally, here we have a very destructive regime where sand is moved, where the actual barrier can be moved as a whole inland due to the combined actions of waves and water levels, and increased water levels. Finally, when you really have very significant storm surge, often that coincide with high tides, then we move into the inundation regime, where the entire coastline becomes completely flooded. While there is a natural progression in terms of hazardous conditions between the swash and inundation regime, the reality is that sometimes the inundation regime isn't as destructive as the overwash regime. For the coastal barrier, it might be more costly and more destructive for the human users of the coast, but it might not necessarily be more destructive for the barrier in terms of morphological impacts. So to kind of put it into a more synthetic way, we have this storm impact scale that provides a general framework for the impacts of storms on the coast, and it merges the interaction of the forcing and the morphology. But then that forcing and the morphology will lead to different types of coastal processes, which are dependent on the morphology mainly, but also on how the forcing is affected by the morphology. That's why we call this morphodynamics, or I mentioned morphodynamics earlier. And then, because of all of these interactions, storm responses tend to be very site-specific, and the impacts of storms tend to be very site-specific. And this leads me to the core of my presentation, which I'll start in a second. But first, I wanted to thank a lot of people that have been helping me throughout the years, with whom I've been collaborating, particularly colleagues at the Algarve University, at Ulster University, and also at UKZN in South Africa. This has been supported by the institutions that are hosting me throughout the years, and also by the funders, particularly the Portuguese Science Foundation, or Foundation for Science and Technology, and the European Union. So I've been very thankful. I'm very thankful to both the Portuguese and European taxpayers for funding my research. And now, what exactly is the research that I've been doing over the past few years? The research that I've been doing mostly involves spending time on the beach, often dragging other people to the beach, into the water to collect data. It's not always glamorous. Most often we go to the beach during the winter when it's cold and rainy and wet. Sometimes it requires patience and a little bit of praying to the GPS gods for the GPS to work. Sometimes it's more fun, and we can actually drive quad bikes on beaches to survey. Sometimes we do go to the beach and record the event itself, and what's happening, what are the detailed processes that are occurring during storm events. But most often we go to the beach and survey it before and after the storm to monitor storm-induced changes. And then we use a range of analysis techniques and modeling to understand in more detail the processes. Sometimes we do go at sea, and that work at sea involves many hours of going back and forth at 4 knots to monitor the seabed along predefined lines with geophysical equipment. Most often is in small, rigid, inflatable boats. Sometimes is what a friend calls rust buckets. And when we're really, really lucky, we get to go on large, comfortable ships that can withstand any storm, and we can do more detailed coring and more detailed surveying. Now I'm going to talk about a few exceptional storm events that I've been working over the past few years. This is going to be a range of different events, and I'm going to start closer to Scotland and then progressively move away into other locations that I've been working. So the first case that I want to present is the case of a record-breaking storm that impacted the northwest coast of the British Isles in December 2014. This was a very deep, low-pressure system that developed in the North Atlantic. And because the atmospheric pressure of this system decreased very rapidly and intensely, it was classified as a weather bomb. I particularly enjoy this diagram of the wave heights that have been generated, or the modeled wave heights generated by this event. So, and one how do I put it? One little curiosity about this event is that the wind and the waves that were generated by this storm were so intense that they generated microseismic signals that were recorded in Japan, which led to a paper by a team of Japanese geophysicists on microseismic signals that got to the cover of Science. So you can understand the magnitude of the forcing when it's generating that amount of energy and propagating throughout the Earth. To place this storm into context, here we can see the observations from wave buoys located offshore the northwest of Ireland and the west coast of Scotland. So the buoy locations are for the Blackstones buoy, which is a black line, is located offshore Scotland, and the M4 is located offshore the northwest of Ireland. You can see that over the 2 years of data that I'm presenting here, the winter seasons are characterized by very intense waves. These intense waves often exceed 10 meters, and we define storms or extreme storms once they exceed the 1% exceedance level. So we could see here clearly that waves were very large during 2013-14, but they were actually much larger during 2014-15 winter. Just to highlight a little bit more the wider context of these wave records is that overall for Europe, the winter of 2013-14 was classified as one of the most energetic in terms of storm waves. It was also one of the wettest winters on record for the British Isles. But the waves generated, while they were very relevant for most of, or were the most relevant for the west coast of Europe or the Atlantic coast of Europe, they were not that extreme comparing to the following year. For the northwest of Ireland and west of Scotland, 2014-15 was indeed the most energetic winter on record, based on wave reanalysis data and based on the relatively short observation by wave buoys. I'm going to now explore a little bit more the details of the storm impacts in the northwest of Ireland. I didn't mention it, but I'll go back, is that this area is the area where we did our beach morphological change surveys. And this is the area that's highlighted here, where we can see the shape of the seafloor. We can see the bathymetry of the coast, which shows that it's quite variable. It changes from relatively deep waters close to the coast on the eastern part, but on the western part of the area, we have a very wide and gently sloping near shore. Below, we have the modeled wave heights at the peak of the storm, and we can see that there's quite a lot of variation. And we had waves offshore close to 60 meters, but when they actually reach the coast, usually they undergo a lot of dissipation of their energy due to bottom friction. So when they actually reach the coast, they are much smaller. If they had to overtake obstacles like offshore islands, and that's what we can see here. They lose even less energy. Nevertheless, we do see that waves still impacted the coast with heights in excess of 60 meters, and a 6-meter wave is a very significant wave. So as you can imagine, it has very significant impacts on the coast, and particularly on sandy beaches, which are relatively mobile. Here I'm showing an example of the actual changes that were observed on the beaches, on two of the beaches in Northern Ireland. And I'm showing the data, and this is a cross-shore profile of the beach, where we can see the elevation and the distance seaward. And we can see in gray, we can see the beach profiles in the year before, in the period before the storm of 2000, that big storm of December 2014. So we had quite relevant changes, but within a relatively narrow range. Okay. Then prior to the storm, the beach was actually at its most accreted state. So it had managed to accumulate more sand than it had before. But following the impact of that specific storm event, we have the beach losing quite a significant amount of sand and lowering its profile markedly. After the storm, the beaches did recover. They didn't recover all the same. Some recover very little throughout that year, throughout the following summer. Others recovered a little bit better. But overall, we have this kind of very strong, very marked impact due to an extreme storm event. In this diagram, we can see the 6 sites, or we can see the volume changes on the 6 sites that we've monitored. And we can see that all the sites undergo a typical cycle of erosion or less loss of sediment throughout the winter, with recovery throughout the summer. And then the following winter is what's really remarkable, is that if we consider that this winter was already energetic, this winter and this particular storm impacted the beach very significantly and drove a significant loss of sand from most of the sites. Afterwards, we do see signals of recovery in all of the sites, but the recovery is less effective in some, usually the ones that have been more impacted, which makes sense. And it highlights the fact that often beach erosion and recovery cycles are annual, but occasionally, due to the impacts of extreme or exceptional coastal storms, we do see changes that will be multi-annual. So in this case, and that's part of the work that we're still doing, is to compute the changes that have been observed ever since that storm, and see if the sites have fully recovered already, or if they're still in the process of recovering. From this set of 6 beaches, I wanted to highlight a specific one for exploring a little bit more in detail the actual coastal processes that drive the erosion, and in this case, drive erosion of in-bait beaches or protected beaches. Here we can see in the top image a diagram that shows 2 lines. One of the lines is it's the base dune line, and we can see a variation in elevation of that base dune line. When we notice that there is a lowering of the dune baseline in specific locations, and when we look at the seawater's edge elevation, and we realize that there are areas when there is a landward progression of the seawater's edge, we can understand that these 2 things are related, and they are related because during these storms, we have the development of rip currents or storm-induced rip currents. Rip currents are not necessarily always storm-induced. They tend to actually happen due to multiple reasons, but during storms in in-bay beaches, we do see rip currents developing, And they develop fundamentally because, as we can see here in the modeled wave heights in the diagram below, because the wave heights are not constant throughout the area. So there's gradients in wave height, and those gradients in wave height drive the development of rip currents. And because those rip currents are located in specific locations, they allow erosion to happen to the dune in those specific locations. So what we see is that along a beach that is exposed to a very significant storm, we do have a longshore variation in response due to the different processes that occur. I'll come to rip currents as a mechanism for coastal erosion a bit later again, but hopefully this was my explanation allowed you to understand this dynamic in terms of storm response through rip currents. The second case study that I'm going to talk about is the impact of a post-tropical storm in that same coastal area of Northern Ireland. So the first case was the very large extratropical storm during December 2014. But now we're going to look at the post-tropical storm to kind of compare the impacts and see how different storms impact the same area differently. So post-tropical storm Katia impacted Northern Ireland in 2011. It began as a hurricane, or it developed from a depression, or from a low pressure generated offshore Cape Verde that developed into a hurricane that made its path towards the US, as happens to most Atlantic hurricanes. Then it shifted its path back towards the center of the North Atlantic. And as it shifted its path, it lost energy and it evolved into a post-tropical storm. That post-tropical storm continued to progress towards the British Isles as a post-tropical storm, but with still keeping hurricane force winds, as we can see here, almost up to the coast of Ireland. The storm had very significant and very intense winds. However, while this was a very significant storm from the meteorological point of view, the reality is that when we look at the storm impacts, and here we have again a diagram of the changes in the beach profile, and we can see some minor, we have the blue profile, which is the pre-storm profile, and we have the profiles after the storm. Oops. And here we can see a map of the difference, an elevation change map, and we can see that there is erosion in red in some locations, but there's also accretion in some areas. So fundamentally, this storm, while it seemed to be a significant event, it fundamentally spread the sand throughout the beach, and it didn't really lead to any erosion. This type of response is typical of the swash regime that I mentioned earlier in the storm impact scale, as there is only minor modification of the beach profile, with sediment being taken from one area, but not really being moved away from the active beach. And why this large storm ended up not having significant impacts? First, it wasn't the forcing, or the waves it generated were nowhere near as intense as the wave generated by the December 2014 storm. We can see here that waves offshore didn't really reach above 6 meters. And by the time they've propagated towards the coastline of Northern Ireland, they had lost a lot of their energy to dissipation on the seabed, also through interaction with the winds, because the wind on this storm wasn't onshore directed, it was offshore directed. So the wind was actually moving the waves, or taking energy from the waves that were moving towards the coast. So this means that we end up having waves reaching this coastline that were not really bigger than 1 to 1.5 meter, which fundamentally is a very small wave to drive erosion. on this type of beach that are used to very significant storms. Okay. Moving again, moving now away from Northern Ireland to slightly further away and going into the Portuguese coastline. This is a slightly older work that I've done throughout in my PhD, and it explores an aspect that is very relevant, and it's becoming more relevant nowadays, which is the extreme erosion and extreme impacts due to storm clustering. Sometimes storms come in a very quick succession, and there's no time for the coast or for the beach to recover. So the impacts of the storm can be of the sequence of storms can be more intense because of this lack of recovery. There are cases as well where storm clusters don't really drive an increased beach erosion, but in this particular case, that was what we've identified. And here we have again a diagram that shows the beach volume changes throughout 2 years of monitoring, where we can see the line shows again that throughout winter, we tend to have some erosion or some loss of sediment on the beach, and then it gradually recovers during the summer. However, when this particular coastline was impacted by this cluster of 5 storms, that drove a very significant erosion, but that erosion wasn't spread along the entire beaches. It was concentrated on specific locations. And slightly counterintuitive to what we would expect, because we would expect that the center of an in-bay beach, like the one, because I didn't properly explain, but you can see that this is a very deeply in-bay beach where we have a more exposed central section and an areas in the boundaries that are slightly more protected by the headlands. So we would expect the center of the beach to be more exposed and therefore to erode more than the area close to the headlands. But that's not what we've seen. And we see that the actual area close to the headlands, so the north and the southern sections of the beach, were the ones that were evidencing a lot more erosion. So we start to look at other morphological indicators to understand why the volume changes weren't really consistent to what we would think. And then that's what we noticed, that there was rip currents developing during the storm. And this is a classification of the type of the presence and the type of rip morphology that we identify in each location. And we can see clearly that when we start to have the presence of a rip neck, or the central channel of the rip, close to where the beach is being monitored, during a storm, we see extreme erosion happening. When there is the rip feeder, which is the channel that drives some water towards the main rip channel, then we also see some erosion, but the extreme erosion is really associated with the rip neck. Translating this into a more graphical visualization, here we can see the storm impacting the coast. Here we can see the storm impacting the coast, and we can see some indications of changes in the way the waves interact with the currents that point to the existence of rip current, of large-scale storm rip currents or mega rips. So these develop because the water piles against the coast, but it needs to come out somehow. And the way it has found to come out is by developing these channels on the extremes of the beach, and the water goes out, but that water also carries a lot of sediment. And here we have a picture, and below we have a picture of the beach after the storm, and we can see this very clearly on the morphology of the beach, in that the central part of the beach is basically relatively has more sediment, so it's relatively robust in terms of sediment, but the extremes of the embayment have undergone significant erosion because there was the establishment of these rip current channels and rip neck channels. Oops. Now moving to a different storm event, and so far we've been looking mostly at storms in in-bay beaches or beaches that are geologically constrained somehow, but storms also impact other types of beaches, and I've been studying storm impacts also in barrier islands. Barrier islands, as the name indicates, are islands that are mainly composed of sand. There can be barrier islands in gravel as well, but most of the cases, barrier islands happen to occur in sand. Barrier islands are very dynamic in that this type of system has been evolving under sea level rise and has been migrating due to sea level rise over the past thousands of years. And they are particularly vulnerable to storms because vulnerable and at the same time they need storms for evolving. And this happens through what's usually called as overwash, or by the movement of sand, of water and sediment throughout the barrier that creates erosion, but also deposition. This specific case was a storm in an overwash episode in the barrier islands, in the Ria Formosa barrier islands in southern Portugal, where we deployed a series of equipments on the barrier to monitor the specific hydrodynamic processes, as well as the sediment transport and morphological evolution of the barrier. This event happened in 2013, or this field study happened in 2013, and fundamentally we measured through video and through through deployment of instruments, we measured the number of overwash events, we measured their peak velocity, and we measure the water depth associated with each overwash event or episode. Based on this record of overwash through over a barrier island system, we then used that to calibrate a morphodynamic model, and the morphodynamic model was XBeach, because we wanted to explore other aspects of barrier island dynamics that weren't really that we can't really monitor in the field because it's very complicated to be monitoring storms in real time. So by using XBeach or using a model, we can explore different aspects of the barrier and obtain better insights of how barrier evolution, how barrier islands evolve due to storms. And I didn't mention, we validated the model using observations. Those observations were qualitative, but also quantitative. I'm not going to go into the details of the quantitative ones, but you can see qualitatively that not all of the events, the intrusion created by the model corresponds to the intrusion that we observed in the field, but for some of them, the match is quite good. So there is confidence. There is not absolute confidence in the model, but there is some confidence that it can reproduce overwash events with relative accuracy. Following that validation, we then explore different types of scenarios to try to understand what were the most important factors driving overwash over that specific barrier island, but the insights can be used in other barrier island systems as well. We tried to see variation in lagoon water levels. We looked also at changing the shape of the nearshore, and we also changed wave characteristics and grain size, because all of these parameters are known to be the most relevant in terms of overwash, of driving overwash in barrier islands. Overall, our results shown that the nearshore shape is perhaps the aspect that controls more the occurrence of overwash. And if we change the nearshore shape, or the way we influence the way waves propagate and how waves break and progress through the barrier islands. So that highlights the fact that each site the response in each site is very specific, because each area will have its specific nearshore shape. Okay. Changing the grain size also leads to significant variation in terms of variation of overwash events. But the nearshore shape or the nearshore configuration is what it drives most the bigger difference. Oops. Yeah. So now I'm moving a little bit further afield and looking at another type of storm, and in this case is an actual hurricane that made landfall in the North Carolina coast in 2016. And it also made landfall in a Barrier Island system. And this Barrier Island system is different it's interesting because we have a very natural beach, or a very natural system, which is Massenboro Island on the south. And we have a heavily artificialized site on the north, which is Wrightsville Beach. So we have here the opportunity to contrast the response between two different sites that have very different types of human use of the coast. For the occupied coast, here again we see beach profiles on the pre and post storm impact, and we can see that there is relatively minor changes. These are all consistent with the swash impact regime, where the beach lost some of its sand, but there's not really overwash, there's not really erosion, because the dunes were unaffected. On the section that is more natural, here we can see that the barrier actually moved inland in most of the locations. And this is an indication that overwash events occurred. So instead of an exclusively swash regime impacting this coast, we had an overwash regime that led to the Barrier Island moving slightly landward in some sites. These impacts of Hurricane Matthew in Massenboro Island and Wrightsville Beach are not really that novel or significant. They're very standard, but they add to the understanding that even for a large storm system, such as a tropical cyclone that impacted a Barrier Island, the impacts can be very site-specific. Interestingly, this coast has been impacted by 4 hurricanes in the past 5 years. So it was impacted by Hurricane Matthew in 2016. It was impacted by Hurricane Florence in 2018. It has impacted then by Hurricane Dorian in 2019. And then this year it was impacted by Hurricane Isaias, or I don't know how to say it in English properly. So here we are now going to explore this consecutive impact of different hurricanes on 2 very contrasting Barrier Island settings. And we are trying to see if the fact that we have on one side an engineered and heavily modified beach, and in the other side a very natural and exposed barrier, shows evidences difference in terms of resilience and in terms of cumulative impacts, or if both sides were actually able to recover after each storm and withstand the following storm without major losses. But that's work to come. It's not yet ready. And now one thing, before moving to the last example, one thing that we must consider when thinking about coastal storm impacts is that our historical records and our instrumental records are relatively short, and we only really have a few decades of measurements, a couple of centuries of historical records that now have been recovered. We're increasingly expanding the quality and temporal scope of reanalysis, but it's still on the bigger picture, it's still a relatively short record. And that means that it's only it's only not possible, but also it's not only possible, but also very likely that extreme events of much higher magnitude than the ones we consider today have occurred in a more distant past and can occur again in the future, especially if we considered a warmer atmosphere and a warmer ocean due to climate change. So this leads me to the last and final case study, which extends the temporal scale of analysis to investigate past coastal storminess in the Southwest Indian Ocean. Here we're extending to the Holocene and working with a different type of methodology, working with sediment cores and geophysical data sets, and also integrating some modeling to understand what can happen on the coast. So offshore Durban, the work was conducted offshore Durban in the Southwest Indian Ocean. And here, waves and storms have been recorded for the past 4 decades. And the largest storm ever recorded in this coast, the waves reached 8.5 meters, and that happened in March 2007. Based on a very long-term record of wave data, the estimates of the 100-year return period storm, waves can reach up to 10.3 meters. So we have this kind of historical idea that more extreme storms in this coast go up to 8.5 meters, and the most exceptional storms are believed to go up to 10 meters in terms of wave heights. However, and thinking of past storms, we know that past storms might have been bigger, and especially this coastline might have been impacted by hurricanes and very strong hurricanes, because they can track slightly further south of Madagascar and impact the coast of South Africa. So while there hasn't been any record of a very significant hurricane impacting the coast of South Africa in the recent past, by looking at the sediments deposit on the shelf, we can start to look and see that there are evidences of bigger storms that were observed on this coast, or that were impacting this coast in the past. This is basically because very extreme storms are so powerful that they can take the sediment from the beach and spread it on the near shore. And the bigger the storm, the coarser the sediment. And once very coarse sediments are moved offshore, it's very difficult for them to move back to the beach. So they tend to stay there as a lag deposit of coarse sediments. So by analyzing a couple of sediment cores that we collected offshore Durban, and we're looking at the sediment characteristics, but also at the geochemistry and geophysical interpretation of seismic profiles, we identified a sequence of storm deposits that were preserved on the shelf offshore South Africa. And we concluded by their geochemical signature, by their sedimentary signature, and by their characteristics, because they are typically finding seaward deposits, which tend to occur during storms. And we can confidently attribute this to storm events, because they are found and because they have never been eroded back, and then there's no records of any other storms of that magnitude afterwards. Our conclusion is that these storms were deposited by these deposits were in place by storms of much higher magnitude than the ones we record nowadays. And this happened during a period of 2,000 years, when the climatic conditions were characterized by strong anomalies in the Indian Ocean dipole. So there was increased ocean temperature, and there is a possibility, or the likelihood, that tropical cyclones were indeed moving further southwards than Madagascar and impacting the Durban coastline. There are signs that very extreme tropical cyclones are developing more frequently in the Indian Ocean. And that means that in the future, we can see the coast of South Africa being impacted by extreme tropical cyclones, just as we've seen the coast of Mozambique being impacted by these events in the past 2 years. So from Overall, from all of these case studies, one thing that becomes evident is that while there is some similarity in coastal response to storms in different barriers and beaches, overall, the morphological impacts are highly site-specific. They depend on the characteristics of the storm or the storms and the characteristics of the beach. The impacts can range from minor erosion, even during tropical storms, or major erosion during extratropical storms or sequences of mid-latitude depressions or extratropical depressions. So, and you can see in this diagram that the same storm, and this is a way of trying to illustrate that, that's the same storm, if it coincides, if it has the right storm track, if it coincides with high tide, if there is a sustained wave run-up and the wind is moving onshore, so the wind direction is offshore to onshore, and the beach is already low, we will have a major impact on the coast. However, the same storm, if it happens and leads to offshore directed winds, if it happens during mid to low tide, if it doesn't really lead to sustained wave run up during several hours, and the beach was actually very robust before, and the storm actually passes fast, that's not going to create a major impact on the coast, regardless of the impact of the dimension of the storm. So we need to take in consideration this, and we also need to take in consideration that our knowledge of storm characteristics and their impacts is relatively limited, as the records of storms is relatively short. And in many coastlines, storms of much higher magnitude may have happened in the past and may happen again, especially if we consider warmer oceans and the atmosphere and warmer atmosphere. One thing is certain, however, even if storms don't change, just because of the sea level is rising, the impacts of storms will increase in the future, and storms will be able to reach higher sea levels and impact more significantly on the coasts. Okay, so this leads.
Just to let you know, Carlos, we have gone over 2 o'clock, so I'm not too sure how many slides you have left.
Okay, I was just gonna, I'm gonna very quickly go through this. Thank you for letting me know, Anna. That coastal storms are important. Currently, river floods are more damaging, at least financially, they're more damaging in Europe than coastal storms, but all the projections point to a much higher impact of coastal floods in the future, and a much higher economic impact of coastal floods in the future and coastal storms. So we can protect beaches from storms. Often the first thing people think about coastal protection is putting seawalls on the beach. However, seawalls don't really protect the beach. They may protect what's landward of the beach, but they actually tend to lead to beach destruction, and they tend to actually accelerate beach erosion and not maintain a beach. So seawalls don't really protect beaches. This is just an example from last week. Protecting beaches might be more effective by moving away from the coast, but moving away from the coast to manage realignment isn't necessarily easy. And people, even local communities that know that the coast is risky, decide to live on the coast and decide not to move from the coast. So there is a challenge there. And then we can also protect beaches using slightly more nature-based approaches. And within this, beach nourishment has become something that it's widespread throughout the world nowadays. And if the best way to protect the coast is with a wide beach, so let's help the beach to become wider through active placing sediment on the coast. This isn't necessarily easy, straightforward, cheap, or feasible in some cases, but it's one of the best options to protect beaches if there is no alternative to move away from the coast. We can, and then this was just a final example, that we can also, sometimes we're forced to think about protection in places that don't really need protection. And this is a case from the northwest of Ireland, where a beach has been eroded due to internal dynamics, and the erosion itself is not a problem, but the local community perceives it as a problem. So in this case, we can use innovative measures or placebos for coastal protection that they don't really make any harm, like seawalls. They don't really make any significant impact in terms of protection, but they somehow appease the communities and give this idea that something is being done to conserve their beach. And so I was going to end up with a final poll to help me find where is the best place to study coastal storms in Scotland. I understand that we're running out of time, so no, Anna, we can keep this as a very short poll.
Yeah, if any of our attendees want to choose one option, please do so. Again, it is anonymous, so don't worry about which one you choose. Just choose the one that you think best answers Carlos's question. Going to give you a couple more seconds to choose places. Okay, so 3, 2, 1.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very useful to know that the majority of you pointed to the Outer Hebrides, because that's exactly what I was thinking about. The Outer Hebrides have some very relevant erosional hotspots. They're also areas that have been studied by Scottish researchers in terms of storm impacts quite significantly in the past. So it's the perfect place to start and look for and continue the work on storm impacts, but now in Scotland. So thank you very much, and apologies for taking a little bit longer than expected to deliver this webinar.
All right, thank you, Carlos, and thank you for that presentation, being our last webinar presenter for 2020. We've had a couple of questions submitted, so we're going to delve right into those. Thank you for everyone who's still with us. If you do have a question for Carlos, please type it in the Q&A box right at the bottom of your screen. His details were on the screen just now on that presentation.
Sorry. I'm trying to recover that slide.
No worries. We are gonna, so for anyone who, you want to look back at any of those slides that Carlos was showing, then please just look at the YouTube channel at the end of today as well. But we are going to delve right into the very first question, Carlos, if that's all right.
Yep. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so this question is from Grant, and it came in quite a little while ago into the webinar, and it says, is beach change during storm surge events very different to the examples that you have considered?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I was lost with the slides.
That's all right. Okay. So the question is from Grant, and it asks, is beach change during storm surge events very different to the examples you have considered?
Okay, so thanks for the question, Grant. Often storm surge is a part of storm events. So the storm surge is a component of a storm. So you'd have when the storm arrives, it usually brings a low pressure system, and that low pressure system and onshore winds, they create storm surge, and the waves impinge on that. So the a storm typically involves storm surge. However, if you're talking about events that are exclusively storm surge, then beach change during an exclusively storm surge event. So here we only have elevation of the water level. If you don't really have intense wave action, the storm surge might create slight modifications to the beach, but it won't drive significant erosion. And hopefully that's clear.
Okay, great. Second question is from Sheila, asking about that beach nourishment that you mentioned just at the end. Surely this whole beach nourishment activity depends on where you get the sediment from. It could impact the coastal ecosystem if you take sediment from other parts of the coast.
Absolutely, Sheila. I had to go very quickly because I got delayed with my other slides. But of course, beach nourishment isn't a perfect solution, far from it. You not only need to consider where you take sediment from, what the impact of taking sediment in terms of the ecosystems that get disrupted, not just on the extraction area of the sand or the sediment, but also on the area that it's deposited. You also need to consider that the impacts of the sediment will be moved, so that sediment that has been placed in one location will impact other areas. So beach nourishment will have significant impacts and will have impacts on coastal ecosystems as well.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question. If anyone else has a question that they would like to ask you, Carlos, right now, please type it in the Q&A box that is at the bottom of the screen. The next question is from Nick, and they say, for dune shorelines, especially in Scotland, is wind erosion an underestimated factor? A switch from swash to local overwash regime can help dunes to migrate inland and maintain resilience. But has the preconditioned dunes by wind first forming / deepening a blowout, which can then channel overwash? Nick then says it is important because the current proposals to infill low points in dunes as a short-term adaptation measure. This will reduce flood risk but prevent sand migrating inland.
Okay, thanks, Nick. It's quite a complex question because it deals clearly with the morphodynamics and the different interactions of beaches and dunes. Yes, indeed, a switch from swash to overwash will help dunes to migrate landwards and to maintain their resilience. That's, for example, that ability to move inland through swash and to rebuild dunes with wind action is what allowed Barrier Island systems to migrate and to maintain, or a lot of Barrier Island systems to migrate landward and maintain their existence under sea level rise. So if we modify the way a dune evolves, we will be impacting overwash processes. And yes, if we start filling in blowouts, we kind of take away the possibility of a dune to migrate through overwash, or in that specific location. However, blowouts tend to be much more related to the wind impact, to the wind effect on bigger dunes. And when we have overwash, dunes that are susceptible to overwash, the wind, there's not that many, there tends not to be that many blowouts that will be infilled artificially. And that might try to rephrase this. If we do areas that are going to be infilled, or blowout areas that are going to be infilled, typically aren't affected by overwash. So it seems that this wouldn't really apply, but I'm not sure. Maybe there are some cases where we can see that happening.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carlos. We haven't had any other questions submitted, but if anyone who is still with us wants to ask you a question directly, your contact details are on the screen right now. So if you fancy dropping Carlos a line, then please do. His email address is on the screen, as I just said. And also, this entire session was recorded. So if there was a slide that you would like to look back on or even share with someone else about this presentation, it will be up on the MASTS YouTube channel by the end of today. So that will be a link that you'll be able to check out at any point as well. That leaves me to say thank you very much, Carlos, for being today's MASTS webinar presenter.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And for anyone who is still with us, I would just like to say that this was our last webinar from MASTS for 2020. I would just like to do a big thank you to all our previous presenters that have given us science throughout this entire lockdown whilst we've been working from home, and to all our audiences who have joined us from around the world as well. We have had a great breadth of talks, topics, diversity, interactions, and an audience that has come from all around the world, as I've just said, and it's been fantastic. We are considering taking this forward into maybe 2021. So if you're a MASTS member or just someone involved in marine science and you would like to use our platform to talk about your work, please contact us, and we would love to have a list of names who could potentially present early next year to kind of restart our webinar series. So if this is something that you would like to get in on, please let us know. Our email address is just masts@standrews.ac.uk.